It was a quiet evening when Captain Elias Corin spotted something unusual in the sky. He stood by the edge of his cabin, overlooking the vast wilderness of the mountains, when a bright light flashed across the horizon. At first, he thought it was a comet or a falling star, something harmless that would quickly vanish. But this light didn't fade. It grew brighter and larger, moving with an unnatural speed. Something was wrong. Elias squinted into the sky, his old soldier instincts kicking in. The bright light split into pieces, and then, with a deafening crash, the object fell to the ground. The explosion shook the earth beneath him, sending dust and debris flying into the air. It didn't seem like a natural event. A spaceship? A meteor? Elias couldn't be sure, but he knew one thing. He had to investigate. Grabbing his old military jacket and a flashlight, Elias hurried toward the source of the crash. The wreckage was deep in the forest, far from the nearest road, and the trees were thick. But the fire from the crash lit up the darkening sky, leading him like a trail. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. It wasn't every day that you saw a ship fall from the sky. As Elias made his way through the thick underbrush, he thought about the years he had spent as a soldier in distant wars. He had retired from active duty, hoping for peace, but peace never lasted. Now, in the quiet mountains, it seemed that something was about to stir again, something beyond his control. After what felt like hours of walking, Elias finally reached the site of the crash. The spaceship was broken into pieces, its metal hull smoldering from the fire. But amidst the wreckage, something caught his eye. There was a small pod, a strange, cocoon-like structure. It wasn't like any human technology he had seen before. It was glowing faintly, pulsating with an otherworldly light. Elias approached carefully, his flashlight shaking in his hand. What could it be? And what was inside? His instincts told him to stay away, but he had never been one to turn back from the unknown. He knelt beside the pod, reaching out with trembling fingers to open it. The moment he touched the pod, the surface seemed to melt away, revealing a small form inside. His breath caught in his throat. It was a child. At first glance, Elias thought it might be human, but as he looked closer, he realized it was far from ordinary. The child had violet skin, her small body wrapped in what appeared to be a silken cocoon. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was slow, almost non-existent. But Elias could see that the child was alive. He had seen enough wounds and death during his time as a soldier to know when someone was close to death. But this child seemed different. Her skin was smooth and almost radiant, like she wasn't from this world. The light around her grew brighter, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw something move inside the cocoon, like energy shifting in the air. He had to act fast. The child couldn't survive out here alone. The wreckage, the strange pod, it all screamed of danger. Someone, or something, would come looking for her. Elias gently lifted the child from the pod, cradling her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless. Her body seemed fragile, but there was a strange strength in her, as though she could survive things no human could. As he started to head back to his cabin, Elias glanced around the wreckage one last time, his mind racing. Who had sent this child? Why had she fallen from the sky? What were they looking for? But there were no answers, just the eerie feeling that he was about to find himself caught in something far bigger than himself. Back at his cabin, Elias carefully placed the child on the bed. He had never been a father, and he wasn't sure how to care for a child. But something told him that this was no ordinary girl. She wasn't from Earth, and she might not even be human. For the next few hours, Elias kept watch over her. He did his best to clean her up, using water from his well and a few bandages he kept for minor wounds. Her skin had a strange texture, unlike anything he had seen before, but there was something soft and comforting about her. Around midnight, the child stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were empty, like she was still trapped in some faraway dream. Then, slowly, her eyes focused on Elias. Her gaze was intense, intelligent, and full of wonder. But there was something else, something almost otherworldly about her stare, as though she could see things Elias couldn't. "Who are you?" Elias whispered, unsure if she could understand him. He had no idea what language she spoke, if she spoke at all. The child blinked, her lips parting as if trying to form words. But before she could speak, her voice faded into a soft hum. It was like a vibration in the air, something Elias could feel in his chest. He froze, unsure of what was happening. The room felt warmer, almost too warm, as if the child's presence was changing the air around her. Elias leaned back, trying to calm his racing heart. "I don't know what you are, but you're safe here. I'll keep you safe." The child didn't respond with words, but she reached out with one small hand, touching Elias's wrist. The moment she did, a strange feeling washed over him, a connection, as if she had recognized something deep inside him. Something ancient, something neither of them fully understood. And at that moment, Elias realized that this wasn't just a lost child from another world. This was something much more important. The galaxy had sent her for a reason. And whether he liked it or not, Elias had just become her protector. The next few days passed in a quiet blur. Elias found himself spending more time with the strange child, whom he had named Aya. He wasn't sure why he chose that name, but it felt right. It was simple and strong, like the child herself. Aya hadn't spoken much since that first night, but she watched him with those intense silver eyes, as if studying him. Elias often caught her staring at the stars through his cabin window, her eyes filled with wonder. At first, he thought it was just curiosity, but then he began to notice something else. Her gaze seemed to reach far beyond the stars, like she was searching for something far away. Elias tried his best to teach her basic things. He showed her how to read simple words, how to hold a spoon, how to walk carefully through the woods. But she learned quickly, too quickly. Within days, she was able to speak in simple phrases, though her voice was soft and musical. "Elias," she would say when she wanted his attention. "Sky," she'd whisper, pointing at the stars. It was on the third day that Elias first noticed something strange. He had been working outside, repairing his tools, when he heard the unmistakable sound of a humming noise. At first, it was faint, like a breeze passing through the trees. But then it grew louder, almost like a low vibration that filled the air. He turned around and saw Aya standing by the window, her hands pressed against the glass. Her silver eyes glowed brighter than usual, and she seemed to be lost in concentration. The humming grew louder, almost musical, as if it were coming from her. Elias's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? "Aya?" he called, but she didn't respond. He approached her carefully, unsure of what was going on. As he got closer, the humming stopped. Aya slowly turned toward him, her eyes no longer glowing. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm learning." Elias blinked in surprise. "Learning? What are you learning?" Aya looked down at her hands, her small fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know, but it feels important." Elias didn't know what to make of it. Her ability to absorb new things was unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't just that she was smart. She seemed to know things instinctively, things beyond her years. Elias felt a strange mix of pride and fear. What was this child? Where had she come from? That night, as they sat together around the small fire Elias had built, he decided to ask her about the crash. He had been afraid to bring it up before, but now, with Aya opening up, he felt it was time. "Aya," he began slowly, trying to find the right words. "Do you remember what happened? The crash, the ship that brought you here?" Aya was silent for a long time, her eyes reflecting the flames of the fire. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I remember the stars. I remember the journey. But it's blurry, like a dream." Elias watched her carefully, sensing that she was holding something back. "Do you know where you came from?" Aya's gaze turned inward, and she hugged her knees to her chest. I came from far away, not from Earth. I'm different. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it made it real. This child wasn't just from another country, or even another planet. She was from somewhere else entirely. Over the next few days, Elias kept a close eye on Aya. Her behavior became even more puzzling. She would often sit quietly, her hands resting in her lap, and close her eyes as if listening to something only he could hear. The humming would return, soft at first, then growing louder until it filled the room. Sometimes, things around her seemed to shift. Objects near her would float for a second or tremble in place, as if affected by some invisible force. One afternoon, as they walked through the woods, Elias noticed something even more unsettling. They were crossing a small stream when Aya paused, her hand reaching out toward the water. A small stone, barely the size of a pebble, began to lift off the ground, hovering in midair. Elias stared in disbelief as Aya's eyes began to glow again, this time with a brighter intensity. The stone floated higher and higher, until it hovered just above the water, spinning gently. Aya! Elias exclaimed, taking a step back. What is this? What are you doing? Aya looked at him, her face calm, almost serene. I can make things move, she said simply. I've been practicing. Elias felt a wave of confusion and awe wash over him. How could a child possess such power? But before he could ask more questions, the stone suddenly dropped back to the ground with a soft thud, and Aya blinked as if waking from a trance. I didn't mean to, she said quickly, her voice soft with regret. I don't always understand how it happens. Elias was quiet for a moment, trying to process everything. There was no doubt about it now. Aya wasn't like any human child. She was something else, something powerful. As the days passed, Elias continued to watch Aya closely, but he knew that he couldn't protect her forever. The world outside his cabin was vast, and it wouldn't be long before someone else found out about her. Someone who might not be as kind as he had been. The thought made Elias uneasy. Whoever sent Aya to Earth had to have a reason, and those who were looking for her, they might not have good intentions. The more Elias thought about it, the more certain he became. Aya was no ordinary child, and there was something more to her than anyone could imagine. But he also knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The days grew longer, and the peaceful life Elias had hoped for seemed more distant with every passing hour. Every time he glanced at Aya, his heart filled with pride and fear. Pride, because the child was bright, full of potential, and growing stronger with each day. Fear, because the more he learned about her, the more he realized she wasn't just a child. She was something far more powerful, something the universe might not want to leave in peace. It all changed one afternoon when the sound of a low hum broke the silence of the cabin. Elias had been outside chopping wood, but something in the air made him stop. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He glanced toward the sky and saw something that made his heart race. A small dot, fast and bright, coming down through the clouds. It was a ship, a spaceship descending toward Earth. Elias's heart skipped. He knew who that was for. Someone had found them. He rushed inside, his eyes quickly scanning the room for Aya. She stood by the window, looking up at the sky with an expression he couldn't quite read. The humming had stopped, but her eyes were wide, her silver irises flickering like tiny stars. Aya! Elias called, his voice sharp. We need to go. Now. Aya turned to face him, her face expressionless. They're coming, she said softly. I can feel them. Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. His mind raced. Who were they? Why were they here? And what would they do when they found out who Aya was? He led Aya into the thick woods behind his cabin, trying to keep as quiet as possible. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual, the rustle of leaves, and snapping of twigs underfoot. It felt like the world was closing in around them. They kept moving for hours, stopping only when necessary to catch their breath. Elias kept his eye on the sky, watching for any signs of movement. The spaceship had landed a few miles away, and he knew it wouldn't be long before they started searching the area. They would find them. As night fell, they reached a small cave near the edge of the forest. Elias had used it for shelter on a few occasions, but never for something like this. He helped Aya inside and made a fire to keep warm. She sat quietly, her eyes glowing faintly as she stared at the flames. "What do you know about them?" Elias asked, settling beside her. Aya shook her head. "They are not like me. They want me back." Elias's heart sank. "Who are they? Where did they come from?" Aya closed her eyes, her brow furrowing, as if she were searching her memories. "I don't remember everything, but they came from far away, from the stars. They created me, for a reason. They're not kind. They will take me back." Elias couldn't understand. If they had created her, why were they hunting her? Was Aya a weapon, something they wanted to control? Or was there something even more dangerous at play? As he sat there, thinking, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cave. Elias stood up quickly, his heart pounding. He motioned for Aya to stay quiet, then moved toward the entrance, his hand resting on the hilt of his old survival knife. They were close. The footsteps grew louder, and then, to his horror, he heard the unmistakable sound of voices. Alien voices, speaking in a language Elias didn't understand. They were searching. Elias's mind raced. There was no way they would escape through the forest in time. The aliens would be on them within minutes. But as he looked at Aya, his gaze softened. There had to be another way. "Arya," he whispered, his voice urgent. "I need you to trust me. Do you understand?" Aya nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will protect you." Elias took a deep breath. He had no plan, no backup, but he had to get her out of there. "You don't have to hurt anyone. Just stay close to me." The sound of voices grew louder, and Elias knew they didn't have much time left. He turned to face Ada, his hand brushing over her hair. "Stay calm," he urged. "You're not alone. We'll figure this out together." Suddenly, without warning, Aya's eyes flashed bright silver. The humming sound filled the air again, and Elias could feel the energy around them shift, as though the very atmosphere had changed. He took a step back, watching in awe as the ground beneath Aya's feet began to tremble. Slowly, the air around her started to distort, like a heatwave rising from the ground. Without fully understanding what was happening, Elias grabbed her hand. "Aya, stop," he shouted, but it was too late. The air shimmered and a blast of energy shot out from Aya's body, sending a shockwave through the cave. Outside, the alien search party froze. They had been moments away from discovering their hiding place, but now they were thrown back by the sudden force. The cave trembled, but it held. Aya collapsed to her knees, her energy suddenly drained. Elias rushed to her side, but she raised a hand weakly, stopping him. "I didn't mean to." Elias helped her stand, his heart racing. "It's okay, Aya. You just protected us. But we need to move. Now." The aliens outside were already regrouping, shouting commands to each other. Elias knew they wouldn't be able to stay hidden for much longer. He grabbed Aya's hand again and led her toward a secret path he knew, one that would take them deeper into the forest, away from the search party. But as they moved, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they had just started something they couldn't control. Aya wasn't just a child. She was a weapon. And now, they were hunted by the stars. The forest stretched out before them, vast and dark. The trees were thick, their shadows looming like silent watchers in the night. Elias and Aya moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The air was heavy with tension. The alien searchers were still out there, and Elias knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. Aya was still shaken from the burst of energy she had released, but she walked beside Elias, her steps steady. Her eyes were downcast, as though she were deep in thought. The way she had used her power, though it saved them, had made Elias uneasy. It wasn't just a simple burst of energy. It had been too strong, too destructive. "Aya," Elias whispered, glancing over at her. "What was that? You could have hurt them, or worse." Aya didn't answer immediately. Her expression was distant, almost sorrowful. "I didn't mean to," she said softly. "I only wanted to protect us. But sometimes I can't control it." Elias stopped walking for a moment, trying to understand. "Control?" he asked. "Can you explain? Can you stop it?" Aya nodded, though her face was still troubled. "I don't always understand how it happens, but when I feel fear, or when someone wants to hurt me, it comes out." She clenched her hands tightly, as if trying to hold back the energy inside her. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but it's hard." Elias felt a wave of sympathy for her. She was just a child, but she carried a power beyond comprehension. She didn't ask for this. He put a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort. "We'll figure it out. I'll help you. I won't let anyone hurt you." They continued walking, keeping to the shadows. Elias led the way, his military instincts guiding him through the wilderness. He had always been good at surviving, at outsmarting enemies. But this was different. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting a child with unimaginable power. As they moved deeper into the forest, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig made his heart race. He kept looking over his shoulder, but there was nothing. The searchers hadn't found them yet, but Elias knew it was only a matter of time. They reached a small clearing, and Elias stopped. He crouched low, motioning for Aya to do the same. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. From here, they could see the distant outline of the alien ship, hovering in the air like a dark, menacing cloud. "We need to keep moving," Elias said, his voice low. "We can't let them find us here." Aya nodded. Though her eyes remained focused on the ship, she seemed drawn to it. Her gaze locked onto the craft, like it held some secret only she could understand. Elias felt a pang of unease. Was it possible she knew more about the ship than she had let on? Before he could ask her anything more, they heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were closer. Elias froze, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. They had been found. A small group of the alien searchers emerged from the trees, their figures tall and shadowy, moving with precision and purpose. They wore sleek black armor that reflected the moonlight, their faces hidden behind helmets. They were here for one thing. Aya. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. There were at least 5 of them, and though he had the element of surprise on his side, he knew he couldn't take them all on. He glanced at Aya, whose eyes were wide with fear. She was shaking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Stay behind me," Elias whispered, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Don't move unless I say so." Aya nodded, her body trembling. She stood still, her gaze never leaving the searchers. Elias knew that if she used her powers again, it could be dangerous for both of them. The last thing they needed was more attention from the aliens. The searchers moved into the clearing, their heads scanning the ground. They were getting closer to where Elias and Aya were hiding. Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to think fast. Then, as if by instinct, Aya stepped forward, her small figure barely visible in the darkness. Elias reached out to stop her, but it was too late. "I can help," Aya said softly, her voice filled with determination. Before Elias could stop her, her eyes flashed again, glowing a bright silver. The humming sound filled the air, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. A strong gust of wind whipped through the trees, and the searchers paused, looking around in confusion. Suddenly, the ground shook. A massive tree nearby, thick and sturdy, began to rise from the ground. It twisted, bending as if controlled by an unseen force, and then, with a deafening crash, it fell toward the group of searchers. The aliens barely had time to react before the massive tree slammed into them, knocking 2 of them off their feet. Elias watched in stunned silence as Aya controlled the tree with a force he couldn't understand. The remaining 3 searchers scrambled, drawing weapons from their sides, but before they could do anything, Aya raised her hands again. The trees around them began to move, branches reaching out like fingers, closing in around the alien soldiers. Elias took a step back, his breath caught in his throat. "Aya, stop," he shouted. But Aya didn't hear him. Her power was surging, uncontrolled. The searchers were trapped, their weapons useless against the force of the forest itself. The air around them crackled with energy as the aliens struggled to free themselves. Elias rushed forward, grabbing Aya by the shoulders. "Aya, you have to stop. You're going to kill them." Aya looked up at him, her face pale. I didn't mean to," she whispered. But the damage was done. The searchers were down, their armor crumpled beneath the weight of the trees and debris. Elias knew they couldn't stay here any longer. The ship would send more reinforcements. They had to leave before it was too late. He pulled Aya to her feet. "We need to go. Now." But as they turned to run, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Aya was powerful, but so were the beings who hunted her, and now they were all in danger. Elias couldn't afford to stop. The aliens would be back soon. There was no doubt about that. They had to move quickly and quietly through the forest. But as they ran, Elias couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The night was dark, the trees thick and heavy around them, but he still felt exposed, vulnerable. Aya was still holding his hand, her small fingers trembling slightly. Her face, usually so calm, was now filled with fear. The events of the last few hours had shaken her. Elias could feel her fear, but there was something else, something darker. She was scared of her own power. "Aya," Elias whispered, keeping his voice as calm as possible. "Are you okay?" Aya nodded, though her eyes didn't meet his. Her mind seemed far away, lost in thoughts that Elias couldn't begin to understand. "I didn't mean to hurt them," she said quietly, her voice filled with regret. "I know," Elias answered gently, "but you saved us. You did what you had to do." He paused, his eyes scanning the forest. The ship was still out there somewhere, and every second they stayed in one place brought more danger. "We need to keep moving, okay? We can't stop yet." Aya nodded again, but Elias could see she was still troubled. Her powers were growing stronger, and she didn't know how to control them. He didn't know how to help her with that. He wasn't a scientist or a doctor. He was just a man trying to keep a child safe. A child who, for all he knew, was not even from Earth. They traveled for hours, following a narrow path that Elias had discovered years ago, a secret trail known only to him. It led deeper into the forest, far from the crash site, but it wasn't safe, not with the aliens hunting them. Eventually, the path opened into a small valley. A creek ran through the middle, its water sparkling in the moonlight. Elias felt a sense of relief as they reached the valley. It was quiet, almost peaceful. The trees here were thick and tall, creating a natural shelter. It was perfect for a rest. Elias stopped to catch his breath, looking around. The creek provided fresh water, and the trees would offer cover. But the moment they stopped, the weight of their situation crashed down on him again. Aya was safe for now, but how long would that last? "Aya," Elias said softly, kneeling down to her level. "We need to talk." Aya sat on a large stone, her eyes still distant. "I know. I feel it too," she whispered. Elias felt his heart ache. He couldn't imagine what it must be like for her. The uncertainty, the fear, her mind and body were changing so quickly, and Elias was powerless to stop it. But there was no time to waste. "We need a plan," he said. "We can't just keep running forever. We need to know what we're up against." Aya looked up at him, her silver eyes meeting his gaze for the first time in hours. "They're not like us," she said softly, her voice filled with something Elias couldn't place. "Fear, yes, but also understanding. They created me to be like them. But I didn't. I didn't want that." Elias nodded slowly, his mind trying to make sense of her words. "I think I understand. They made you different, didn't they?" Aya bit her lip, looking away. "I was never supposed to be like this. I was supposed to be perfect. I don't remember much, but I know they wanted to control me. And now," she shook her head, "now they'll do anything to get me back." Elias took a deep breath. He had known it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, but hearing it from Aya made it more real. The aliens weren't just searching for her, they were after her. They had created her for a reason, and they would stop at nothing to control her. "We won't let them take you, Aya," Elias said firmly, his voice filled with determination. "We'll find a way to protect you." But deep down, Elias knew the truth. Protecting her might be harder than he thought. The aliens were powerful, and Aya didn't even fully understand the extent of her own powers. It was only a matter of time before they caught up to them again. Just then, they heard it. A distant sound, like a low rumble, followed by the sharp crack of something breaking in the woods. Elias immediately stood up, his hand on the knife at his belt. His instincts were screaming. "We're not alone," he muttered under his breath. Aya's face went pale. She grabbed Elias's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "They've found us," she whispered. "I can feel them. They're close." Elias's heart raced. He knew they didn't have much time. The alien ship was in the sky, and the soldiers were surely searching the area. They would be here any minute. "We need to move," Elias said quickly, pulling Aya to her feet. "Come on." But as they turned to run, the air around them suddenly shifted. Elias felt a wave of energy wash over him, and a strange sensation filled his body, like static electricity in the air. Aya's eyes were glowing again, her hands trembling. "I can't control it," she whispered, her voice full of panic. "It's too much." Before Elias could react, a blinding light burst from Aya's body. It was so bright, it hurt to look at. The trees around them shook, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Elias shielded his eyes, but he could feel the power radiating off Aya, stronger than ever before. "Aya, stop," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But Aya's power was out of control. The force of it ripped through the valley, sending shockwaves through the forest. Trees bent and cracked, and the ground split open in places, forming deep fissures. Elias couldn't keep up with her anymore. He couldn't protect her from what she was becoming. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light faded, and the valley fell into a heavy silence. Elias opened his eyes, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The alien soldiers were here. They had arrived. Elias stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. The aliens had arrived. A small group of soldiers, clad in sleek armor and carrying advanced weaponry, moved through the trees, their steps silent and precise. They had been drawn to the valley by Aya's outburst of power, and now they were closing in. Aya was trembling beside him, her hands still glowing faintly from the energy she had unleashed. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Elias, they're here. They're going to take me." Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no time to waste. He knew he couldn't defeat these soldiers, not alone, but he couldn't let them take Aya. Not after everything they had been through. "We need to move," Elias whispered, his voice urgent. He grabbed Aya's hand and pulled her behind him, ducking low to avoid being seen. The alien soldiers had not spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of time. The sound of the soldiers' boots crunching against the forest floor was getting louder. They were getting closer. Elias pushed through the underbrush, his heart pounding in his chest. Aya was quick to follow, but he could feel her fear. She was scared, not just of the aliens, but of her own powers. She didn't know how to control them, and Elias could sense that she was terrified of what might happen next. They reached a small hill that overlooked the valley. Elias crouched down, pulling Aya beside him. They lay flat against the earth, trying to stay hidden from the soldiers below. Through the gaps in the trees, Elias could see the alien soldiers scanning the area, their weapons drawn, searching for any sign of movement. Elias's mind raced. They needed a plan, but time was running out. The soldiers would be on them any second. His hand tightened around the hilt of his knife. He had never been one to run away from danger, but the odds weren't in their favor this time. His only chance was to outsmart them. "Aya," Elias said softly, his voice steady. "I need you to stay close to me. Whatever happens, don't use your powers unless I say so, all right?" Aya nodded, her face pale but determined. She trusted him. He could see that in her eyes. The soldiers below were moving in a tight formation, methodical in their search. Elias watched them carefully, his mind working quickly. There were too many of them, but he had one advantage. He knew the forest better than they did. The alien soldiers were trained in combat, but they didn't know the terrain. He had the knowledge of the land on his side. "Aya, we're going to split up," Elias whispered. "I'll lead them away, and you run. Find somewhere safe. Don't stop, no matter what. Do you understand?" Aya hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. "Elias, no. I don't want to leave you." "You have to," Elias said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're the most important thing right now. They want you. I won't let them take you. But you have to trust me. I'll keep them busy." Aya looked at him for a long moment, her expression torn. But then, finally, she nodded. "I trust you." Elias stood up, motioning for Aya to stay hidden behind the trees. He knew she could still hear him, but the less she saw of what was about to happen, the better. With one last glance at her, Elias turned and sprinted down the hill, heading toward the alien soldiers. The soldiers saw him almost immediately. They turned in unison, their weapons aiming directly at him. Elias didn't slow down. He had only one chance to buy Aya the time she needed. He dove into the trees, using the dense foliage as cover. The soldiers followed, their footsteps heavy and determined. Elias moved quickly, staying low, darting from tree to tree. He could hear the soldiers shouting orders to each other, their voices sharp with urgency. They were closing in, but Elias knew the forest better than they did. He was used to being hunted. Elias reached a large, hollowed-out tree trunk. He paused for a moment, catching his breath. The soldiers were getting closer, but he had a plan. As they moved past him, he launched himself forward, tackling the nearest soldier. The alien's armor absorbed most of the impact, but Elias didn't care. He had the soldier's weapon now, an advanced energy rifle that hummed with power. The other soldiers turned in shock, but Elias didn't hesitate. He fired the weapon, sending a blast of energy into the air. The shot didn't hit anyone, but it caused enough distraction for him to duck behind another tree. He fired again, sending a second shot just over the heads of the soldiers. It wasn't a direct hit, but it gave him the moment he needed to move. He ran, zigzagging through the trees, trying to draw their attention away from Aya. The soldiers fired back, but their shots missed. Elias was faster in the forest, using the trees as cover. He could hear the soldiers yelling at each other, their voices getting more frantic. They were starting to realize they weren't going to catch him easily. But Elias didn't have much time. His movements were starting to slow, and his energy was running low. The soldiers were relentless, but Elias had no intention of letting them catch him. He had to keep them occupied until Aya was safely out of sight. He fired another blast from the rifle, aiming for a large rock. The explosion sent debris flying, and the soldiers ducked for cover. Elias took the opportunity to double back, moving in the opposite direction. But as he ran, he heard a faint crack behind him. A branch snapped, and a figure stepped out from the shadows. Aya. She was standing there, her eyes glowing bright silver. She had followed him. "No, Aya," Elias shouted, but it was too late. The soldiers saw her immediately. Their eyes locked onto her, and they raised their weapons. "Aya." "No," Elias shouted again. "Run." But Aya didn't move. Her power was already building inside her, and Elias could see the fear in her eyes. She was going to fight. And that's when Elias realized the truth. The aliens had underestimated her. Aya wasn't just a child. She was their greatest threat. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The soldiers had Aya in their sights, their weapons aimed directly at her. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was racing. He had to do something, anything, to protect her. But this time, it wasn't just about running. Aya had become more than a child to him. She was family. He couldn't let them take her. "Aya." "No," Elias shouted, his voice full of urgency. "Get out of here. Run." But Aya didn't move. Instead, her silver eyes were fixed on the soldiers, and Elias could see the storm building inside her. He could feel the air growing heavier, charged with energy. Her powers were swelling again, stronger than ever before. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "We have you now. There is no escape." Aya's hands began to glow brighter, her body tense as she prepared to unleash whatever power was building within her. Elias knew she didn't want to fight. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. Determination. "I won't let them take me," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Elias's heart sank. He had to stop this. He didn't want her to make the same mistake again, using her power without control, risking everything. He had to find a way to calm her down, to make her see that fighting wasn't the answer. But how? "Aya, listen to me," Elias said, his voice filled with desperation. "You don't have to do this. They're not going to hurt you if you come with me. We can leave. We can find somewhere safe. Please." For a moment, Aya hesitated. Her glowing hands wavered, the light flickering like a dying star. Elias saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a small crack in her resolve. She was listening, just for a second. But then the leader of the soldiers spoke again, his voice sharp. "You cannot escape, little one. This is your fate. You are ours." That was all it took. The final push. Aya's power erupted. A blast of raw energy shot out from her, knocking Elias off his feet. The air around them crackled with intensity, and the ground beneath their feet trembled as if the earth itself was trying to flee from her power. Elias barely managed to push himself back to his feet, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and awe. The alien soldiers were taken by surprise. They tried to fire their weapons, but the energy from Aya's power pushed them back, knocking their guns out of their hands. The soldiers stumbled, struggling to regain their footing, but they couldn't reach her. Elias watched in disbelief as Aya, her face pale with exhaustion, stood tall, her hands stretched forward. The soldiers were now trapped, unable to move or react as she controlled the environment around them. Trees twisted and bent, rocks lifted from the ground, and the sky seemed to darken with her energy. But as Elias watched, something inside him began to click. He realized that Aya wasn't just defending herself. She was protecting him. "Aya, stop!" Elias cried out again, but this time his voice was gentler, more understanding. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Please, stop. You don't need to hurt them. We can end this." Aya's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to pause. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Elias saw the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to hurt anyone. She just wanted to be free. "Please, Aya," Elias whispered. "You don't have to carry this burden alone. I'm here for you. We're in this together." Let's go home." For a long moment, nothing changed. The soldiers were still trapped in place, unable to move, and the air was thick with the energy she had released. But then, slowly, very slowly, the glow around Aya began to fade. Her hands dropped to her sides, the raw power dissipating into the air. The forest, once alive with energy, fell silent. Aya's breathing was shallow, and Elias could see the strain in her face. She had pushed herself to her limits, but it had worked. The soldiers were no longer a threat. "Aya," Elias said, his voice full of relief and pride. "You did it." Aya looked at him, her silver eyes softening. She was exhausted, her body trembling from the effort, but there was a faint smile on her lips. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." Elias moved closer, carefully placing a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't. You protected us. You didn't let them take you." Aya nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. The fear in her eyes had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of peace, though it was clear she still had a long way to go in understanding her powers. Elias knew that, but for now she had made the right choice. The alien soldiers, now disabled and disoriented, were starting to regain their composure. They were still alive, but they were no longer a threat. Elias looked at them with a mix of determination and defiance. He wouldn't let them take Aya. Not now. Not ever. "We have to go," Elias said, his voice low. He turned back toward the forest, signaling for Aya to follow him. "The fight's over for now. But we can't stay here. The aliens will send more soldiers. We have to keep moving." Aya nodded silently, her face reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and hope. She had fought. She had won. But more challenges lay ahead. As Elias led her through the trees, the faint sound of distant engines hummed in the air. The alien ship hadn't left yet. It was waiting. But so was Elias. He knew they would have to confront the aliens again. But not today. Today, they were safe. For now, at least. And that was enough.